All right, hello everyone. Rich Hagan sitting alongside Hall of Famer Randy Buehler here to talk about Magic Online Draft. And Randy, before we get into all the color pairs, let's set the scene a little. Put some context on these five colors and what we're going to see.
I mean, this is core set. Origins draft. Core set tends to be a little bit simpler. It tends to be a little more block and tackle, a little more vanilla. I mean, Magic is just awesome. So just having creatures and spells that interact with each other, it's definitely got that. So there are color pair synergies baked into the set. You know, the different color pairs have certain almost suggested archetypes. But we're not talking about Modern Masters, right? It's not like you're stitching together a constructed deck. Well, maybe for you, Watson Abe, but in general, you're going to be playing with a lot of good cards, and so you'll see more overlap between the color pair draft orders, so sort of the rankings of the commons than you would see in other cards. The real defining thing for me about Origins Limited is the blocking. Right, it's renowned creatures that the opponent has to block, and it's combat tricks, trying to force through that renowned creature and just hit them once, or trying to punish the opponent for trying to do a double block. So it can turn into a very aggressive format, because if you've got the right tricks, your opponent is on their back foot already turn 2, turn 3, trying to block and stabilize the board. So it can play very aggressively. Combat tricks are very important. Just super interesting draft format, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's a world where the tricks are aggressively costed at 1 and 2 mana, and a lot of the good creatures are aggressively costed at 1 and 2 mana,
right.
Which means that with 3 mana, you can often not have this choice of, am I going to play a trick and that's my turn 3, or am I going to make a guy? Instead, you get to do both a lot of the time, and that's super interesting.
No, it's very insightful. It's absolutely true.
Okay, so why don't we get into it? We've got 5 color pairs coming your way today, 5 tomorrow. Why don't we start off with white-blue flyers?
Yeah, so Thunderclap Wyvern is great. If you're in the white-blue deck, many of your best cards are going to have flying anyway, and it's really that Thunderclap Wyvern that just gives the deck its identity. Pretty classic blue-white deck in the grand scheme of things. Bounce effects are good, tap effects exist. Flyers are hard for the opponent to deal with, so if you can kind of gum up the ground or just bounce your opponent's creatures, Thunderclap Wyvern really lets you attack with flyers and kill the opponent relatively quickly.
So why don't we see what you've been drafting? The winning decks. Let's take a look. These are the most frequently 1st through 5th picked commons among draft winners on Magic Online. So these cards are going into winning decks all the time.
Yeah, you see Separatist Voldmage at the top of the list. That, you know, it may look like an overcosted Mana War to people who've been playing it long enough to remember Mana War. It's totally fine. The effect is absolutely worth 4 mana. Separatist Voldmage is one of the best blue commons you can get. And Suppression Bonds, even at 4 mana, just the ability to eliminate your opponent's permanent. You can nail an equipment in a pinch. Doesn't even have to be a creature. Those are great cards. You see Topan Freeblade is actually 5th on this list, which is pretty interesting to me. We're actually going to go through all of the different white archetypes this morning, and Topan Freeblade is commonly seen as, you know, arguably the best common creature in the set, one of the reasons why white is the best color, but the blue-white Flyers deck not as dependent on Topan Freeblade as some of the more sort of ground-aggressive white archetypes.
Okay, why don't we take a look at the top 5 uncommons that you're picking in your winning decks for this particular archetype. Thunderclap Wyvern, Whirler Rogue's a lovely card, Jesse Thief, Sentinel of the Eternal Watch, and Swift Reckoning.
Yeah, this archetype, the white-blue deck, gets what I think are the 2 best uncommons in the set, in Whirler Rogue and Sentinel of the Eternal Watch. I think that they would be a little higher on this 1st through 5th pick list if you got past them more often. Right. You get past the Thunderclap Wyvern, that card is gonna find its way to the blue-white deck. So I think that's kind of why the way this data is set up, it winds up at the top of this list. It is the defining card of the archetype, but the fact that those Whirler Rogue tokens, if you're lucky enough to get your hands on a Whirler Rogue, making 2/2 Thopters is just better than making 1/1 Thopters.
Yeah, and as a by-the-by, Separatist Voidmage, you can even do that to your own Whirler Rogue, and hey, let's have some more 1/1 flyers along the way.
There you go.
So there's all sorts of fun activities with that. That is your white-blue flying archetype. So as Randy says, we're going to stick with white. This time, we're going to go the yin and yang of the format. We're going to go white-black. And Randy, enchantments is your kind of overall theme.
Right, not such a loud theme that you must draft it when you're white and black, but there are some nice synergies built in. Auramancer getting back Weight of the Underworld, the blood-crazed knight, the little vampire that hits really hard. They've got some nice synergies baked in where you can kind of make a control deck, you can Blight Caster for value. It's on the slower side of decks in this format, but if you can manage not to get run over by your opponent's early threats, you really have a lot of sort of grindy, attrition-based value that you can eke out in the mid-game.
Let's look at the commons then. The top 5 commons being picked by you in your winning decks. Topan, Freeblade, Suppression, Bronze, Removal, and Stalwart Aven.
Yeah, and you see the Freeblade goes up to the top here. This archetype really needs to be able to impact the board immediately and not get run over because it's a little clogged on 4. Like you see Suppression Bonds here, crucial to the deck to have that enchantment, especially the enchantment that kind of hangs out in play. But it does cost 4, so does Way to the Underworld, so does Blight Caster. So get that Topan Freeblade down first, block, hopefully you get away with trading with your opponent's first creature, and you can kind of build up to where you want to be. Reave Soul also very good at impacting the board right away on turn 2.
Let's go to the uncommons then. Top 5 uncommons picked by you at home in your Magic Online winning draft decks. There is the Blood Cursed Knight. And those gold cards, there aren't many of them in the set, but they are nice little gifts. The fact that they will naturally gravitate to you if you are in the right archetype.
Yeah, Blessed Spirits is another one that, for most people, it's just a Windrake, right? It's just 2 and a 1-colored mana for a 2/2 flyer. In this deck, though, he starts to build up to become a pretty big threat. Knightly Valor is the other card that can sometimes float a little bit because it's 5 mana and the format has a decent amount of bounce, but it's exactly what the white-black player wants.
If you are relatively new to Magic, watch out for Knightly Valor and the way that the pros play that card. It's a huge deal if you can make it stick because you're giving +2/+2 to your creature. That's potentially a fly. It's going to become huge. And you get the 2/2 Vigilance. That's a big deal. Okay, you're paying 5 mana for it. But watch the way that they play it. Most of the time, we're not going to see them run a Knightly Valor into an open set of mana on the other side because you're just setting yourself up to be 2 for 1. Be patient is the key with something like that.
That's exactly right. Cruel Revival is the other 2 for 1 that was on that list. It's no particular synergy with Cruel Revival, but it's just great value, especially if you have a couple zombies floating around that you can regrow.
Okay. If you're not a great player, the quicker you can get your opponent dead, the better. Give them as few turns as possible. Our third archetype tries to do that. Red-white, go wide or go home.
Yeah, this is... I think if you polled the room, they would tell you this is the best archetype in Limited.
Sure.
It is very powerful. It comes out very aggressively, and we've talked about how the format rewards you for being the aggressor, sort of attacking into your opponent's block with a combat trick at the ready. You get combat tricks out of both your colors. You've got super aggressive creatures out of both your colors. It's a very good deck.
Okay, so why don't we take a look at the commons that are being most highly valued by the winners in this archetype, Topan Freeblade, of course.
Absolutely.
And then we'll unpack our Girapur Gearcrafter, Removal in Lightning Javelin and Fiery Impulse, and Suppression Bonds.
Removal, absolutely. Fiery Impulse being particularly nice removal in that it only costs 1, so it does give you those tempo turns where you can remove a creature and also play an additional creature of your own.
One little tension that is there is the fact that both Suppression Bonds, in brackets I put Pacifism,
sure.
Lightning Javelin, in brackets I put Lightning Strike Incinerate. Because they cost 4, there is a little deck building puzzle there because sometimes red-white aggro wants to be a 15-16 land deck, but those cards, Javelin and Suppression Bonds at 4, really want you to be 17, and some cards in red-white actually want you to go as far as 18. So it's an interesting deck building
Yeah, I think it's mostly a 17 land format. You don't see a lot of the 15, 16. The format isn't, because you want to get the 3 mana on turn 3 to go combat trick and creature.
Yes.
So you're not just flooding the board with as many 1 and 2 drops as possible. You really want those tempo turns. Okay,
let's look at the uncommons then in red-white. What are you getting success with? Once again, it's gold. Well, unsurprisingly, it's double striking Erosis Champion. The Lieutenant is a card I love. Acolyte of the Inferno, Patron of the Valiant, and Thopter Engineer.
Yeah, all just super efficient creatures. Acolyte of the Inferno in particular, like, what are they supposed to do? You play this 3/1 guy. If they block him, their creatures take damage, so it's really hard to block early on, but then if you let it hit you, it gets renowned, so it gets even bigger and even harder to block. It's a very difficult creature. If they don't have a removal spell for it the turn you play it, just a very difficult creature to deal with.
Right, for sure. All right, so that's red-white. We have one more white pair to give you, and of course that is green. This is the home of Renown.
Yeah, definitely. This is, I think, the best creature set in terms of you get a little more beef, you get a little more renown. your creatures are a little bigger, they're also a little bit slower for that reason. You know, your key uncommon being the 3-mana Wardens. Patron of the Valiant is great, but it's also 5 mana. It's a good deck. It does focus on Renown and creature tricks, but it's a little notch slower than the red-white deck.
Okay, now we've heard this morning people talk about how the green is probably the worst color of the 5.
Yes.
I know that you are perfectly prepared to stand up and be countered and say white is the best of the 5.
Yes.
But do you in fact think that white-green is the best pair to go with white?
No, I think that you go white-green if green is super, super open, and in particular, if you can get the key uncommon. Like the Castellan is just such an efficient creature that you can get a good white-green deck, but if I have my druthers, I want to be white-red, or I want to be white-black. Or I want to be white-blue. I think it's actually the weakest of the white color pairs.
Right, fair enough. Well, why don't we see the commons that are still getting the job done in green and white for you? Of course, there's Topan Freeblade, the removal of suppression bonds. And I guess, Randy, the reason suppression bonds is at the top, is that going to be about just needing to give yourself that little bit more time?
This has been true of green-white for as long as Magic has existed. They aren't removal colors. And so it's really hard to deal with your opponent's threats. So you see suppression bonds goes to the top of the list because there's so little removal in those colors that when you get the opportunity to draft anything, take it. And Wild Instincts is also arguably the best green common. It's either Wild Instinct or it's Leaf Gilder, because again, you're in a non-removal color, and you just want the ability to, clear a blocker so that you can attack, or kill the bomb so that you can get it off the table.
On raw numbers, Rhox Maulers as a 4/4 trampler for 5 doesn't seem spectacular. Once it's into gameplay, it gets a lot more spectacular very quickly.
Yeah, the word trample is the crucial part. Like, 4/4 for 5, not a great deal, but the fact that it tramples means if you have a combat trick, a Titanic Growth is the card that a lot of green mages just swear by. Titanic Growth is better in this format than it's been in sort of any of the other formats where it's ever existed. Being able to trample over, you only got to eke through 1 point of trample damage, suddenly you trigger Renown, now you're a 6/6 trampler, and yeah, that's the game plan that works when you're the green mage. You just have to kind of survive those turns to get your 5-mana guy into play and then have the opportunity to attack with him.
Right. So what about the uncommons then? Let's take a look at those for you in green and white. Here they come. Citadel, Castellan, fabulous. Undercity Troll, Valeron, Wardens is a very good card. Sentinel of the Eternal Watch again. And Patron of the Valiant. Now, I've got to be honest, I'm a little surprised to see Patron of the Valiant there, largely because it feels like it's, I know there is no such thing as half a turn, but it feels like it's half a turn slow a lot of the time, and it's often vanilla a lot of the time.
But when it's vanilla, it's fine. 4/4 flying for 5 is a great rate.
Sure, Air Elemental.
Air Elemental's very good, and you do sometimes get the extra +1/+1 counters as well, especially in green-white.
With Topan Freeblades, for example.
You're the Renown deck, right?
Yeah.
You can have, I've seen green-white decks that have a dozen Renown creatures in them sometimes.
Sure. All right, so that's a green-white, but we've done all the white. Why don't we go right to the far end? We can get as spiky and as evil as we can possibly make it. It's time for blue-black, and that means the world of the graveyard.
Yeah, this is a control deck. This is the control deck of the format. You can build it a number of different ways. The graveyard synergies are they're not super loud. You do have the ability to Screeching Scab and, get a little bit of value back with a Possessed Scab. But really, if you're blue-black, you're just trying to gum up the works, control the game, and then win with something. Maybe it's a graveyard synergy, maybe it's the card advantage you can get from Cruel Revival, maybe it's just a Sphinx's Tutelage. Maybe you actually take those graveyard fillers and sometimes you even point them at your opponent, especially if you've got a Sphinx's Tutelage deck. That can be a very powerful victory condition for this blue-black deck, is it really just wants to kind of block and trade and kill stuff and get ahead on card advantage.
You've been inside R&D in Wizards of the Coast making core sets for many years along the history of Magic. I want to ask you, is there a deliberate thing? You said it's a fairly light theme of the graveyard. Is that in part because in core sets, requiring players to focus on yet another zone is a kind of tough thing, because they've, you most of the time with core sets, you want to be here and just going hand, battlefield, life total in a kind of pretty much linear way of playing?
I do think that core sets in general want to have sort of, they want to be a little more accessible. They want to be a little easier. That said, I think Origins is, in my opinion, it's in a great spot just as a Magic set. I don't want my 2-color archetype to be rammed down my throat, I want to have a little bit of flexibility, and I can ignore the graveyard thing and just be a card advantage, 1 for 1, draw some cards, kind of a blue-black control deck. So I like the way Origins has some synergy that you can sink your teeth into, but you're not required.
Okay, why don't we see how that plays out in terms of the cards that are delivering success in the blue-black archetype. Let's take a look at the commons for you. And we've certainly got Reave's Soul there, Unholy Hunger. We've seen Separatist Voidmage. Interesting to see Claustrophobia, which is a heavy blue commitment because it's double blue. And Read the Bones. I want to ask you about Read the Bones particularly, Randy, because that's a card that's featured multiple times in Magic history. And the 2-life in an aggressive format, is that something that comes back to bite you, or do people generally have the time to, for want of a better term, skip their 3rd turn in order to Read the Bones?
It's a drawback. It is a very real drawback, but the card is super powerful. I mean, it's not just draw 2, it's scry 2 first. So you kind of can think of it as, draw the best 2 of the top 4. It's not quite that good, but the 2-life is real. You can't Read the Bones as your first play in this format. What you need to do is Reave Soul or Putrid Imp is another card that I find really good in blue-black in particular.
Fetid Imp, right?
Sorry,
the 1/2, yeah.
The 1/2, sitting back on defense, threatening death touchdown, their best attacker. I think that you got to do something first, and then on turn 3 or turn 4, you can Read the Bones, and you've already sort of traded or set up blocks, and you're able to then sort of slow the game down where that 2-life is not a devastating drawback.
So let's see where that Read the Bones takes you. It digs you deeper into your library, maybe towards some of these key uncommons in the archetype for blue-black. So let's see what the uncommons are. And we have Whirler Rogue, Cruel Revival, Possessed Scarb, so gold once again featuring there. Tower Geist, a card I like very much. And Thessian Thief, how hard is it in this format to make Thessian Thief work?
It's not trivial. I mean, everybody knows they're going to need to block renowned creatures, so sneaking through an Ophidian-style creature isn't trivial. But look at it's 2 for 1, 2 for 1, 2 for 1, 2 for 1, X for 1. Blue-black is the card advantage archetype for me more than it's the graveyard archetype. It's just, if that's the kind of Magic you like to play, the blue-black deck is there, and they're not the most popular colors, right? White and red are the most popular colors, so you can get that deck, or you open something nice that leads you that direction. You can usually count on getting past some of the goods.
Yeah, so it's neither the most popular in terms of white-red, but nor is it the green which people are trying to avoid. So it's in kind of quite a nice spot.
I think so.
All right, well, those are the first 5 of our color pairs. Brian David Marshall will be with us here tomorrow to take us through the other 5 color pairs as we develop our understanding of this fledgling draft environment. So right now, those are our first 5 Magic Online draft archetypes.